talk to each other. Part of what we want to do is give some time to network and get more information about things. Look for lunch. And then what we'll do is at 11:45, if we can kind of come back in here relatively promptly, we do have what we call our Aaron Bailey lecture series. It's part of our department's grand round. So Dr. Kim O'Brien will be doing it. And Aaron's family will be here. And so they'll do a little introduction to who Aaron was and a little bit on the lecture series. So we'll start that at 1:45. So yeah, thanks everybody. And I counted, just FYI, I did a quick count. So if anybody saw me looking at you, I was actually counting. There's about 150 people in the room. That's my rough count. And the last I looked, and I'm not sure how many people are doing sort of watch parties, but there was 36 people online. So, I'm going to round it up and say 200 people so far. So that's pretty cool.
Hi, could we come to order? Is the mic hot? Okay. If I could get your attention, please. Please continue with lunch, but we're going to start the noontime program a bit early. I'm Dr. Michael Allen from the Department of Psychiatry here. I have the great pleasure of being the faculty sponsor of the Aaron Kent Bailey Memorial Suicide Prevention Lecture. The program today and tomorrow was built around this event, which is now in its 16th year. It was begun after the death by suicide on March 1st, I want to say 2007, of Aaron Kent Bailey. Aaron was a proud member of the 82nd Airborne Division. He had a parachute malfunction during a jump, which left him with serious injuries. He subsequently developed mental health problems and was treated at the Denver VA, which at that time was back on 9th. He struggled for years, finally dying by suicide at the young age of 35. He'd be 53 now, 53 if he had survived. And his friends and family created the fund that has supported this lecture now for 16 years. So we're grateful to have had this opportunity to talk about suicide prevention, and in the course of doing that, to work on many other things, including the Colorado crisis system and other things related to suicide. And we've had a really august faculty over the years. It's been a pleasure to bring in some of the leading lights in the suicide prevention world. It's also been a part of the program that each year I talk about what we've been doing in suicide prevention and whether it's working or not. And the way we know whether it's working or not is that there is a government program that tracks vital statistics, including the violent death reporting system. And Colorado is a participant in the National Violent Death Reporting System. So we know every year how our suicide prevention efforts have been faring. And I'm pleased to tell you that we've continued a downward trend since 2021. We're not out of the woods. We're at roughly the same level that we were in 2016. So I think it's certainly fair to say that suicide continues to be a big problem in Colorado. We've traditionally been in the top 10 states for suicide, along with many other states in the Mountain West. Particularly worrisome is this upper line you see here, which is suicide fatalities among 19 to 24-year-olds. So while the state as a whole has been improving somewhat, this is provisional data that I'm showing you here, and the final data is probably going to be a bit worse. But particularly among younger people. So over the years, used to be that older white males had the highest risk. But as time has gone by, we see that risk shifting so that the peak risk is now among 19 to 24-year-olds. And that's something that we are very aware of, having Children's Hospital on the campus. Want to thank Christine DeMott, particularly from Colorado Public Health and Environment, for sharing that with me in advance of its public release. So at this time, I'd like to welcome Judy Fredrickson up to introduce something we show every year to remember Aaron. Judy, come on up. So we'll share with you some moments from Aaron's life, and thank Judy again for supporting this over these many years. Judy has shown up every year for this. Judy and her Aaron's father also, Jim, who couldn't be here today.
Oh, is this on? Wow. I've never had such a good mic in all my years. This is a great mic. Costs a lot of money too. Oh, it's wonderful to see so many people here for this reason today. As you saw some of the pictures of Aaron, the video you're going to see shows when he was 3 months old, and there is a beautiful bouquet of red roses. So I always bring some kind of roses. So I have 3 red roses for him that's over there, and 3 yellow for my late husband. He was Aaron's stepdad. And the beauty of this extended family is that Aaron's father, who you will hear playing the cello on the video, he and his wife, Aaron's stepmom, and Jack and I were in this together from day one. And the wonderful thing is now I travel with Jim and his wife, who is also his second ex-wife and a significant other. That's how close we are. So Aaron was always kind of a different child. In the very beginning, he didn't love to be hugged. We didn't know why. He loved sports. He never was a professional athlete, but his sports took him to being the 82nd Airborne. And he loved the 82nd Airborne. He was crushed when he had to get a medical discharge for that. So I hope you will keep in mind that if you learn one thing from anyone here that could help you deal with someone who is suicidal, this whole day is well worth it. So it's just a 3-minute video. You'll see Aaron as he grows up, some funny things, and then you will see him at the very end, and he was more stoic. And he'd attempted suicide maybe 5 times. I had found him 4 of them, and he made sure I didn't find him the last time. So I want to thank Matt and Michael and all the people at the Depression Center, and now all these wonderful athletes that are here. So enjoy the little video, and then our speaker is going to be wonderful. So thank you.
Thank you so much. And thank you, Judy. This is our 16th year. And, even though we're in a department of psychiatry, it doesn't mean that everybody gets training in suicide prevention. It doesn't mean that everybody is aware, has the same levels of awareness. And, as I look out across the room today, I think a lot of what we talk about is suicide as a societal issue, and how every one of us, we all have a role to play. And if that's just reaching out to the person next to you, asking questions, asking them tough questions, being willing to listen, it's amazing just how far that can go in terms of preventing suicide and just understanding where somebody else is coming from. So these, the lectures have been so amazing to get the word out and to expand knowledge and expand understanding. And again, just to remind people that we all have an somewhat easy role to play. They're difficult conversations, but having conversations can really, really, really go a very long way. So I am here. I'm going to introduce Dr. Kim O'Brien. So she is our speaker this year. Dr. Kim O'Brien is a founder and director of Unlimited Resilience, LLC. It's a group mental health practice designed for athletes, by athletes. She's the co-founder and director of Better Together, an athlete peer mentoring program. She's also a research and training consultant at the Behavioral Research and Training Institute at Rutgers University. Dr. O'Brien received her BA from Harvard in 2000, where she was a 4-year member and co-captain of the hockey team, which won a national championship in 1999. She obtained her MSW and PhD, both from Boston College, and completed her postdoctoral fellowship at Brown University. Her research is focused on the development and testing of brief interventions for suicidal adolescents and their families, with additional specializations in substance use, interventions with utilized technology, and athlete mental health and suicide prevention. Dr. O'Brien has co-authored multiple articles and book chapters related to adolescent suicide, substance use, and mental health, and was awarded the Young Investigator Research Award from the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention in 2019. She is also the co-author of Emotionally Naked, A Teacher's Guide to Preventing Suicide and Recognizing Students at Risk. In addition to providing individual and group therapy in her practice, Dr. O'Brien works with high school and college teams across the country on mental health, mental skills, and suicide bereavement and prevention. So with that, let me introduce and say thank you to Dr. O'Brien.
Thank you so much, Matt. Thank you, Judy. I just hope that we can all, I'm just so grateful to Aaron Bailey's family for making this possible for me to come here. And I just hope that during this talk, we can have him in our hearts. And I also, we're going to talk very in depth about suicide in this next, 45 minutes, hour. And I just want to make sure that we are taking care of ourselves and each other during this time. So anytime you need to go out, get a drink of water, take a walk, please do. You won't offend me by leaving. This is a lot, especially there's a lot of young people here in the audience, which is awesome to see. But it's sometimes I think as professionals, we can forget that, like, we talk about this stuff all day, but for some people who aren't quite used to that, talking about athlete mental health, suicide prevention, so much in one day can be a lot. So really do take care of yourselves and each other however you can. Let me see, I'm going to try to figure out how to use this. Always a problem for me. So this first slide is just like the learning objectives and disclosures, references that I'm supposed to put up saying I have nothing, nothing to disclose here. But I want to get started before we get into some of these unique risks of athletes in the military. I think it's really important that we understand the prevalence and the context for this. So luckily, I was able to pull up some of the CDC information slides before somebody decided to take them down from all over the place. But I did it before, so we're good. So this is, if you take a look at this slide here, this is the past 2 decades of suicide rates. And we can see they've increased 37% from 2000 to 2018. Dipped a little during the COVID year, but the rates have returned to their peak. And what we can see too is when we we want to understand why this rate continues to climb. So to understand that, we need to look at the means used. And the reason for that is that the single best predictor of whether or not someone will die by a suicide attempt is the method that they choose. And that's why this graph's so interesting. So if you take a look, you can see this is from 2011 all the way up to 2022. This one is, but as you can look, take a look. The dark blue line is suicide by firearm, and the lighter blue is suicide by other means. And what you see is that they're very similar up until about 2019. And then what you see there is that it starts to diverge. And we start to see that the suicide by firearm is increasing while suicide by other methods is decreasing. Now, Johns Hopkins looked at this and did some analysis on this, and they found that in their statistical analysis that all of the increase in suicides from 2019 to 2021 was driven by guns. And this is particularly important when we consider the unique risks to military personnel and veterans, as they're more likely than civilians to have access to a firearm. And let's now take a little more of a closer look at veteran firearm suicide. So in the past 20 years, 87,000 veterans have died by gun suicide. Now that's 16 times more than the number of military personnel killed in action in the same period of time. Veterans are 3 times more likely to die by suicide with a gun than non-veterans. And if we look at the graph on the top right here, we can see how disproportionately at risk our veterans are. And their rate, it's climbing significantly faster than ours, than civilians. The bottom right shows veteran suicide deaths only. And what we see here is from 2001 all the way up to 2022, I think it's the final one here. We can see, again, a steady climb, except for the little COVID dip that we had, but it is climbing back up again. So now let's focus on athletes and what's been happening for the past 2 decades there. So what we see here are 2 separate graphs of causes of death for NCAA athletes in the first decade, 2002 to 2012, and the second decade, 2012 to 2022. So what we see is that the number of student athlete deaths on the whole has not changed significantly, but the causes of death have. What we see here, take a look at the red, that's cardiac deaths. That's gone down significantly from that first decade to the most recent decade, while suicide for NCAA athletes has more than doubled. And as we take a look at these suicide deaths in greater detail, we can see that they're happening primarily during the months of the year that they're in school. So now we can look at the epi data and everything, all that we want, but to really understand the prevalence and what's really going on, these risk factors and why people are dying by suicide, we need to start with the theory. Okay, we need to really understand the theory that underlies why people die by suicide. So that's hopefully what you'll come away with in part today. So I'm gonna discuss the seminal theory of suicide, which is Joiner's interpersonal theory of suicide. And as you can see here, this theory is from 2005. Now, as far as biopsychosocial phenomena go, this is a really new theory. You know, they're the most biopsychosocial phenomena, the theories that that explain them are much earlier than that. So that just tells us that we're behind in the suicide field. You know, we don't really understand this phenomenon that well. So what Joiner proposes is the perception of burdening others and of being socially alienated. These 2 things combine together to instill the desire for death, and that people won't act on that desire for death unless they have developed the capability to do so. So let me explain a little bit of this in greater detail. So what Joiner and his team posit is that suicidal desire is made up of 2 things: perceived burdensomeness, so this idea that one's own existence is a burden to their family, friends, or society, and thwarted belongingness, so feeling that you're alienated by others, not an integral part of a family, a circle of friends, or group, okay? Let's let's think a little bit now about what kinds of things for athletes in the military, what kinds of things might make them feel like a burden or feel disconnected. Some might argue that, well, being a part of a team or part of a battalion or a part of anything, that is protective. Well, it may be until it isn't. And what I mean by that is there are some things that can pull the athlete away from the team and away from the group. Getting benched, getting injured, being, hazed, bullied, ignored. There's also these transitions out of sport, out of the military. Things like this, we really need to pay attention to. The second part of Joyner's theory is this acquired capability for suicide. And what he says is that without having this acquired capability for suicide, that death by suicide cannot happen. Now, again, it's a theory, okay? But what Joyner states is that when you have repeated exposure to painful or fearsome experiences, people acquire a higher tolerance of pain and therefore a sense of fearlessness in the face of death. And it's only once you've had these repeated exposures that you're actually able to have a lethal attempt. So let's think about for athletes in the military, what kinds of things may make them acquire this capability for suicide? I mean, combat itself, 100%. There's a lot of sports that cause a lot of physical pain. And this isn't just like, of course, football, right? But it's every sport has their own way of incurring pain. Like I think a lot of the rowers I work with on the erg, like that, there's nothing more pain inducing than that. There's also injuries that happen across both populations. And for veterans and military, excuse me, there's PTSD symptoms. And when people have symptoms like re-experiencing or flashbacks, they're being repeatedly exposed to those painful and fearsome experiences. So all of these things together are what are contributing to this acquired capability for suicide in these populations. So here's this final Venn diagram that I think makes the most sense, where basically what this theory is saying is that to have the desire for suicide, you must have a combination of thwarted belongingness, meaning just feeling alone, and a perceived burdensomeness, feeling like a burden. Those things together combine for the desire for suicide. But what we know is that not everybody who wants to die, not everybody who has suicidal thoughts goes on to kill themselves. So what this theory is proposing is that it's not until you also have this capability for suicide that lethal suicide attempts can occur. So the next theory that kind of came along after this is one by Klonsky and May, and they kind of built upon Joyner's theory, and they call it the three-step theory of suicide ideation to action. So kind of trying to understand, okay, what makes it so that people go on not just from just thinking about killing themselves, but to actually doing it? So the first step of their theory is asking, are you in pain, emotional pain, and are you hopeless? If both of these things are present, then that combines for suicide ideation. The second step would be, does your pain exceed your connectedness? If so, then that means there's a stronger, more intense level of suicide ideation. In that final third step, do you have the capacity to attempt suicide? Again, building on that Joyner's acquired capability, and that leading to a suicide attempt. So I got very interested in these theories about 5 or 10 years ago, and I decided to plan my own study to understand this ideation to action process in teens. So I conducted in-person interviews with teens, 20 teens, right after they'd attempted suicide, and they were psychiatrically hospitalized. And I developed a semi-structured interview guide, which I used the voices of people with lived experience to help me develop this. And I then went in and did these interviews with these teens. And I asked a bunch of questions, but the 3 key questions that I'm going to talk about the findings for are, number one, what led up to your suicide attempt? I really wanted, my whole point is I wanted them to be able to sit and tell me their story of why they tried to kill themselves. And then after what led up to your suicide attempt, I wanted to ask the question, how did you go from just thinking about suicide to actually trying to kill yourself? Again, trying to get at that ideation to action, like what is it that propels somebody to actually try to kill themselves? And lastly, I was interested to know how much time passed between when you thought about it and what you actually did it, and when you actually did it. So the first finding for the first question of what led up to your suicide attempt found that there were 16 specific contributing factors, and they were all over the 4 overarching themes. The first theme being a historical theme, which that would include history of psychiatric or medical concerns for the adolescent, having a precipitating event to that suicide attempt, so something, something happening in their life that triggered it, and or any physical, sexual, or emotional trauma. The other theme was a sociocultural theme that came out of this qualitative study. And we found that school and extracurricular stress were some things that led up to the suicide attempt, as well as suicide contagion, which we define as when there are other people in the adolescent's community, friends, acquaintances that die by suicide. We also found some interpersonal themes of family and peer conflict that contributed to suicide attempts, as well as intrapersonal. By intrapersonal, we mean like the inner psychological experiences that an individual may have, things like feeling like a burden, feeling a lack of belongingness, being emotionally dysregulated, feeling trapped, feeling invalidated, feeling guilt, feeling a lack of purpose or reason for living, feeling shame, and feeling hopelessness. So that's what we found for the general contributors. But then getting at this question of how did you go from thinking about suicide to actually trying to kill yourself, it was very interesting in that we found that the strain caused by those first 3 themes, the historical, sociocultural, interpersonal, that alone was not enough to propel one of these teens to go on and attempt to kill themselves. What it was this interaction with the intrapersonal factors that drove the transition from ideation to action. So what we saw here is that these intrapersonal factors, so again, I'll go back, this like burdensomeness, lack of belongingness, inability to regulate emotions, feeling trapped, feeling invalidated by others, feeling guilt, feeling shame, lack of purpose or reason for living, or hopelessness. It was having these things on top of all of the other things that seemed to be the catalyst in this process from ideation to action. And third, related to the question of how much time passed between when you thought about it and when you actually did it, we found that 75% said it was less than half an hour from when they thought about it to when they attempted. Now that's a very short amount of time. And, over half were less than 10 minutes. And this is actually not surprising, though, because in this study done by Kathy Barber and her team out of Harvard School of Public Health, they have a great study, a great website called Means Matter. I put it right there if you want to take a look at it. But the findings in a study by Houston of teens and young adults found that half of them deliberated for less than 20 minutes and a quarter for less than 5 minutes. And then another study by Diesenhammer showed that half deliberated for less than 10 minutes. So really, the amount of time that people are thinking about suicide before they act on it is very short. And so why is this important? Well, it's because these suicidal thoughts, they can be fleeting and worsened by these interpersonal factors in a matter of seconds. And what that's demonstrating to us is the importance of access to means and limiting them. So we know that means safety is such a critical thing because the suicidal crisis is often short-lived. And we know that firearms is the most lethal means, which, going back to speaking specifically to athletes and the military and their unique risks, military have greater access than civilians to firearms. So they're just disproportionately a greater risk because of this. And for a lot of college athletes, a lot of college campuses pose a greater risk for lethal means. There's a lot of campuses with bridges, trains, high buildings, and things where the likelihood that they will die using that method is much higher than another. So these are things we really need to consider when we're looking at suicide prevention efforts in these communities. So now that we kind of understand some of the theory and the nuances involved in why people die by suicide, let's examine a little bit further what may put college athletes at unique risk. So about, I think it was like a year ago, Elaine Anton Lotrulio, who's here somewhere, she reached out to me to collaborate on a study she was beginning to conduct of a systematic review of suicide risk factors unique to college athletes. And I was excited to work with her, and she's just doing some really amazing work. And in the study, we came up with 5 main themes. I'm going to list them quickly, and then I'll get into each one. First, what is unique to college athletes is this convergence of academic and athletic pressures, toxic team culture, barriers to accessing services, complexities of the athlete identity, and experiencing injury. So let's go through each here. When we talk about convergence of academic and athletic pressure, it's so important to think about all that the college athlete has to do. It is really, I mean, I played, gosh, I think I'm coming up on my 25th reunion this year, which is crazy to me, but the amount of time we spent, on the ice and in competition and in training, it's much less than it is now. Like it is an absolute day-to-day grind for these college athletes. It's a lot. Now I'm not saying that in a negative way. It just is. It is a lot of time and effort they're putting into it. And what that does is it makes it really difficult when you have to put all that time and effort into your academics. And, whereas there's a lot of college students who come in and all they have to focus on, not all college students, but some, all they have to focus on is their academics. That's all they need to do. So when athletes come into this and they have to focus on both, it is a lot of time, a lot of pressure. And what it can do is these time demands, they can affect sleep and nutrition in really important ways. And what we know is at the bare minimum, the most important thing you can focus on is what you're eating and how you're sleeping in order to feel better. So athletes don't have enough time to sleep oftentimes, or else something else is going to suffer. And so, and because of this and this pressure to perform in these multiple areas of their life, and never mind academics and athletics, what about being a friend? Being with your roommates. Some are in sororities or fraternities, some are in other clubs or other things that they do. It is a lot on people's plates. And these are young adults. These aren't adults. These are young adults, older adolescents who haven't yet are just learning to build these skills in time management and balance. And I think it was you, Dr. Shi, talking about balance, just like screw that word. Yeah. I mean, you cannot balance anything. It's like it's going with your own values and what it is that is important to you to focus in on that time and being fully present. But it's easy for us to say as old people, right? But as young, no offense to you, I'm older than you probably, but young kids, this is hard. This is a hard thing to teach them. It's very, very difficult because it's a skill that you acquire as your brain develops. The second one we find is toxic team culture. Now, toxic team culture can look like a variety of things. First of all, coaching. Coaching varies across different places, across different universities, but especially nowadays compared to, a few decades ago, any sort of yelling, critical coaching is really become less and less and less effective over time. And it feels abusive to these young athletes a lot of the time. For people like us, when we grew up, maybe it was just kind of the norm and what people did. But as we're learning, there's been more and more transformational leaders who have come out and to show us oh, you don't need to just yell and scream at people and criticize them to motivate people. In fact, that actually is not motivating. So it's been thanks to some of these wonderful coaches, I personally love looking at Carol Lawson's stuff from Duke, Coach K when he was at Duke, just a lot of people who are really great role models for great coaching. But I think that kids today, they are not motivated by this. They don't stand for it either. They will stand up to it, which I think is very impressive. But it's this toxic team culture that often comes from the top down, from the coaching. Also, hazing and other forms of interpersonal violence among teammates. There's thankfully been, people are cracking down on hazing more so than, a couple decades ago, but it's still very prevalent. And not just overt hazing, but also just interpersonal communication patterns that are not healthy and not helpful can really affect an athlete's mental health. And what it does when you're in a toxic team environment, when there's a toxic team culture, it affects your psychological safety. It affects how you feel in that environment. So you don't feel comfortable taking risks on the field, off the field, wherever. Your confidence will suffer, and it can have long-term health and mental health implications. Another issue, and we've talked about this a lot today too, which is great, is this barriers to accessing services. So what we know about student athletes is that they are less likely to seek mental health services than their non-athlete peers. The reasons why for this is unclear, and it's probably different from place to place. One thing we know though is that some of it is about stigma and a pressure to hide it. That if you go seek help, that you're considered weak or vulnerable, and it's not good to be vulnerable because you need to show everyone around you that you're mentally strong because that's what is expected of you. And oftentimes in college, university settings, they were, even if those services are offered there, they worry their coaches will find out. Even if they don't, they will worry they will, just because they're under the same umbrella. Like I have a couple contracts as an outside contractor with two colleges, Stonehill College and Brown University, where I work with the women's hockey teams. And part of the reason they brought me in as an outsider is for that reason, because they're not using their college health services because they're afraid that things will be reported. And so luckily, these are two great coaches that I work with who find that, mental health is very important, and they want to give that. They want to put money towards it and the resources towards it and give that to their young athletes. There's, in addition to these concerns of confidentiality, which is a barrier to accessing services, a lot of times they're afraid to utilize the regular college mental health services because they don't think they're going to understand the role of sports to them. A lot of times, and I'm sure a lot of the therapists in here who work with athletes will agree with me that a lot of times people will come to us as, maybe we're their third stop, and they'll say, my past two clinicians just have told me to quit when I say that something's going wrong with my sport. Like, I don't want to quit. I just want to, my sport's important to me. But they often feel misunderstood by certain mental health professionals. The other issue and barrier to accessing services is when help is not accessible. So what we mean by help being not accessible is a few things. Number one, maybe you're under-resourced at the school and there literally isn't the help. Or maybe that, I think Suzanne Potts was talking about it earlier about like, if your athlete mental health services are not housed near your athletic department, they probably won't use it. Or right near them. They often don't want to go into the college health services. Like at Harvard, we have when you walk over a bridge to get to the athletics. And so I've talked with them before, like if you don't put counseling over the bridge, across the river, no one's going to go. They're not going to go. So it's all about making it accessible to it however you can to whatever college athlete population that you have. Another one that we found is of a contributor, unique risk factor for athletes is the overall complexities of the athlete identity. What we know about college athletes is that they have a dual role of student and athlete. And this role, the athlete role, can hold a lot of things. Number one, it can hold a lot of status a lot of times, okay, which can play into a lot of their reason, for or against seeking help. It also can hold a lot of pressure and oftentimes a lot of stigma. I mean, for us, I remember when I was there, all of our teammates, when we got there as first years, they said, do not wear your issued stuff to class. You'll get discriminated against by the professors. Like, don't go. Like, they'll give you worse grades. So that stuff happened then. Maybe it's different now, but there's a lot of different roles that athlete role can play. And the other thing that we want to think about too is this athlete role at some point in everyone's life does come to an end. And when it does come to an end, there is an enormous sense of loss and disconnection. And athletes often think like, without this athlete identity, like, who am I? which is why it's so important. And people have said it throughout today, which is wonderful. You are not an athlete. You are a person who plays sports, and you're a person first. And it is the single most important thing I think that a coach can say, that other people like parents can say, because it needs to be repeated frequently, because especially, in today's world with this just such an emphasis on, and people were talking about today, like colleges want to win, like they have to keep their jobs. We need kids to understand, and young adults on these teams, like you are a person, your self-worth is detached from your performance. It is just imperative that we're really imparting this on our kids. Lastly, experiencing injury. So injury in itself can sometimes be a traumatic event, the actual injury itself. It often requires surgery, lengthy rehab. And when you're out, it has a very strong effect on your identity. You're a part of a team until you tear that ACL, and then you're on the sidelines for a long time, and you feel disconnected from the team. You feel stressed about whether or not are you going to be able to come back. If I do come back, how am I going to do this? Am I going to be as good as I was before? There's so much going on. Any injured athletes in this room, I'm sure, can relate to what this feels like. And it carries a tremendous risk for suicide. Just simply experiencing that injury and the disconnectedness that can come with it, and how hard it is on your confidence coming back. So, although understanding these unique risk factors for athletes is a really important first step, we need to go beyond these risk factors to get a real nuanced understanding of why student athletes die by suicide. Autopsy studies, survivor interviews, they can aid in helping us understand this. And Elaine Anton-Lotrulio is doing a study on this currently as the next step from the systematic review, to really understand like the why behind it all. It's not enough to just know what the risk factors are. We really need to dig deeper, and also to really start putting interventions for student athletes at the forefront. And I loved what people were talking about earlier today too, about how we don't need to reinvent the wheel here. What works, athletes are humans first. So what's going to work for, the gold standard for, for instance, like our gold standard for a suicidal crisis is doing a safety planning intervention. That is going to work for athletes too. However, the way we implement it may look different. Finding out where and how to best do this with athletes is where the challenge is, I think. More of a focus on implementation research with the evidence base we already have is going to be really important. So finally, let's talk a little bit about some of our implications for prevention, okay? I think that it is so important that coaches, trainers, everybody, and this has been said all day today too, which is it's always wonderful when so many people are, preaching similar things. It means we are on the same page, and it's just a matter of getting this disseminated and getting action, taking action steps here. But we want to make sure that there is a lot of education and training. Now, the question could be too, like, what kind of education and training? What are we training them to do? There is, gatekeeper training is evidence-based too, that it's helpful. There is, I believe, a specific gatekeeper training for coaches. I think it's a QPR one, but I apologize that I can't remember exactly which one it is. But for athletes, it's just really important that we're doing this. I also, think that Department of Defense education, they're a little, I think, actually further along than the athlete space, given how, disproportionately at risk that military personnel and veterans are. But, there needs to continue to be put funds into this training for everyone working with veterans in the military in any capacity. The second thing we need to focus on when we talk about prevention is fostering supportive environments. Now, this is this is everywhere. This is supportive environments on teams at the university level. It's for athletes, it's so important that people feel supported, that they can come when there is a concern and that they're not going to be punished for it. It's very easy to say this though, to foster a supportive environment, much harder to do so, because there is this, the emphasis on winning, it at times can contrast with the other. And there could be accountability issues that come up. There's a lot of difficulties, a lot of concerns that can come up with this idea of fostering supportive environments. And a lot of coaches that I talk with aren't quite sure how to do it because they want to make sure they're continuing to push their athletes athletically as they should, but they're not sure because they're not trained as a mental health professional how far to push, how to do so. So I think there needs to be some partnerships between us as therapists, as educators, of how to help them do it in different ways where they can still, meet their goal of winning, but, make sure they're doing it in a way that's emotionally healthy for the young adults that they're affecting. Identity development beyond the athlete and the service member is critical. I mean, so much work that I do now with athletes is about who they are as a person outside of their sport. Because with an injury or something like that, sport can be pulled from you any second. Or even if you're not injured, you get benched, something happens, something goes wrong in your sport, it can feel like life is over, especially for young adults and teenagers. So being able to help people develop their identity beyond the athletic arena is so critical. It's also important when athletes do get injured. How do we keep them connected? This is super important, I think, because we need to do a better job of this, I think, as coaches, as trainers, as anybody involved in the mental health of the athlete. We need to figure out better ways to keep them connected, because it feels very alone when you're on the sideline. It really does. And it's something that I think there just needs to be more support poured in for this. And I think, one way that can be helpful, I'm just going to kind of skip over a little bit to the peer support piece, is if peers support can aid in some of this connectedness. Peers all over the place are wanting to give back. Look at how many young adult athletes are in this room right now here. It's because they care and they want to make it better for everybody else. So we need to leverage this. Daphne Faldy and Maura McCarthy and I, we started a company called Athletes Better Together, and it's a peer mentoring company where we have a bunch of really motivated young mentors who want to give back and want to be able to help young athletes in high school and in colleges with any sort of mental health struggles that they may have. And I really think this is the key for athletes. And like you see all of the nonprofits who are here talking about what they're doing, that's what they're doing. They're bringing, they're going to where everyone's at, where these kids are, what they want. They don't want to hear from someone like me, a 46-year-old woman, telling them anything. They want to hear from people who've just been through it. They want to learn from them. So let's bring those people to them. I think that's going to be one of the most important things we can continue to keep doing. And it's awesome to see so many of us are doing it in this room. We also really need to improve the delivery and the accessibility of mental health care. I think that the DoD is trying to do it with the military. I think the college athletics is trying to do it. I think it's struggling though to figure out what's effective, because I think there's just a lack of trust there still that we need to figure out how to help. There's a lack of resources in a lot of places. It's definitely an unequal distribution of resources, very difficult. So we need to work on that piece to figure out like how and why are athletes now not getting the care that they need. So maybe we need to do some more needs assessment within different universities to figure this out place to place. I'm not sure. Again, I don't think this is a one size fits all. I think every place is a little bit different. And lastly, and I'll argue most importantly, is that I think means safety, including safe storage and gun lock distribution programs, that's what's going to move the needle on suicide, is means safety. It really is, because that's ultimately who dies by suicide, it's the people who use the most lethal means. So that's going to be the most important critical part. So I just want to thank you all for, for listening and for the time taken. Feel free to reach out to me if you're interested in collaborating, talking, anything like that. I'm going to switch the slide now though and put up, I'll put up the evaluation slide, but open it up for questions too, while that's up there. Does that sound about right, Matt? Okay. And I hope I'm okay on time. I have no clue what time it is, so. Very good. Okay. All right, so we have some time for questions. Anybody, anybody? Yeah. Hi, Taylor. For the one, my study that I did? The one, because only one of these is my studies. Do you mean the? Oh, okay, yes. So that's a great question. So that was a qualitative study that I did on very short money, meaning like, I knew NIH wasn't going to fund anything qualitative because they just don't. But I'm a big believer that qualitative research is super important to understanding the why behind why we do things. So that's partly why I had to do everything myself at that point. But it was a hospital that where I used to be affiliated with, and I did a lot of work on the inpatient psychiatric unit there, and it was we just sampled. They had to meet the eligibility criteria was that they had to have made a suicide attempt in the past week. That was their reason for being there. And that was like pretty much the main thing. And so and because of the unit that I was working on, a lot of the teens do come in after that. So we're actually able to complete the study relatively quickly that way. Yeah. Good questions. Yep.
I'll bring the microphone out too, but so sorry, the QR code is for American Psychological Association credits. For those of you who want or need those.
Was there a high prevalence in the study you were just talking about, or just in the work that you've been doing? You mentioned interpersonal relationships. Is there a high focus on, because we're focusing on young adults a little bit here, on like boyfriend, girlfriend, like romantic relationships? And do you think there's an importance for looking into that kind of specifically, or is it kind of just like, should we just look at interpersonal relationships in general?
Great question. I always think if you can look at something with more specificity, you'll get more, more clarification on it. Because it wasn't the central goal of this study, we did ask about that. So like if we were to go back and take a look at all the transcripts, we could tell which were relationships, romantic relationships, which were friendships, which were, familial. We could look at all of that for sure. But for the purposes of this study, our sample was too small too to really look, too in depth about that. Although an N of 20 for a qualitative study is pretty typical with respect to what you would imagine finding, saturation. But so yeah, I think it depends on your research question. If you want to ask specifically about romantic relationships and their impact on suicidal thoughts and behaviors, then the key is to make sure that all of your whether it's qualitative interviews, your questioning, or if it's quantitative, your the measures you're using are mapping directly on to the types of research questions that you're asking. But the most important thing you can it's important that we're asking questions about anything we think's important. And I agree that I do think that the romantic relationship piece is huge. And I can speak from that anecdotally, working with suicidal teens for a lot of my lifetimes, that's frequently a big piece of it. Because a lot of times when you lose a romantic partner, it's a loss of self as well. And it brings up a lot.
Yeah. In your study, these these patients, I mean, obviously they survived.
Yes.
Was the reason why they survived, was it because their attempt was interrupted? Or was it because it didn't work?
That's a great question. For this sample, none of them were interrupted or aborted attempts. So just for people to know kind of the terminology there, an interrupted attempt is when somebody tries to kill themselves, but somebody else interrupts the process. Whereas an aborted attempt is when somebody goes to try to do something to kill themselves, but they stop themselves. So all of these were, a lot of the kids that were in this study were, they came to us after having been on a medical unit, and, had to have medical treatment, and luckily they survived, and were here after having survived an attempt.
So Kim, we had one question online. Can you address the intersection of substance misuse and suicide?
In a few minutes? No. But I will, yes, okay, I will. I mean, this is another passion of mine too. Another area of my research, but there is a very strong bidirectional relationship. I mostly have done, I have to say, I've mostly done alcohol use studies, and that's more where my knowledge is than other substances. But speaking with alcohol use and suicidality, there's a very strong bidirectional relationship, meaning like when people use alcohol, it can it causes like the disinhibition that may cause somebody to act on suicidal thoughts. But also sometimes the effect of alcohol as a depressant can have its own sort of effects on suicidality. So it's like the worst drug, the worst substance for suicidality, I feel. However, what we've seen recently with marijuana, with cannabis, is really concerning, because we're seeing a lot of there's so much mixed information and mixed results from studies on cannabis use and the relationship with suicidality. Because what typically happens is people typically, when they're using, they're not feeling suicidal. That's why they're using a lot of the time. They're using cannabis. But then what happens is, if you use cannabis for such a long amount of time, it attacks and I'm not an MD, so forgive me for speaking in layman's terms here, but it attacks the motivational and reward system in your brain, so that over time, like you don't develop the coping skills and the things you need to be able to really manage like suicidal crises when they come along. And so it has long-term effects on your brain, such that we're seeing that it actually, even though in the beginning it may seem that using cannabis may have a protective effect against suicide, in the long term, it's really detrimental. So that's another really, dirty drug with respect to suicide that we want to watch out for. But I think it's also important, though, it's not a one-size-fits-all approach with substances and suicide. Like, not everybody uses to self-medicate. While some do, not everybody does. Some people will use, and then their suicidal thoughts will come about the next day. So it's really about like understanding, whether it's as a peer or as a researcher or a clinician, like really asking the right questions to understand for that individual what is how that suicidal process is coming about for them. So those are just a couple little thoughts of mine on suicide and substance use.
Dr. Twing does a lot of research on generational kind of trends. And one of the things she trends from is 2012, when the smartphone came alive. And all the numbers of adolescents, for example, having their first sexual partner, taking their first drink of alcohol, have dipped significantly, which my question to you is, now when we're talking to these young adults in between that 19-24 range, are you asking any of those questions, understanding like, is the first time that we're dipping into more risky behaviors, or we're like gradually independent from our families and don't have that support system at our home? Is that just happening right now at the college level? Have you dipped into any of that background?
And are you talking about I just want to make sure I understand your question. So are you asking if for all these generational changes that we're seeing, am I as a clinician asking those questions when I'm working with athletes, or am I as a researcher doing that work?
Both.
Okay. Well, I have to say, I was heavy on research for, that was the bulk of what I did. I'm a social worker by training, did my bulk of my work in research while I was having kids, because it was just easier for me to deal when you're so exhausted as a mom, to just focus on the research. But now that I have the emotional capacity to do the clinical work, which is what I really, really love, that's what I've been doing the past like 5 years or so. So for right now, I'm not investigating that in a research way in any way. I've kind of, put the brakes on a little bit with the research and put the gas on with the clinical work. But what I will say about the clinical work is that I always talk with them about this kind of stuff. I think the most important thing we can do as clinicians is get as curious as we can about the person that's sitting across from us. Like, to really, the best work is done when you really get to see the soul of the person that's sitting across from you, and what makes them tick, what sparks them, what are their values, especially when you're working with someone who's suicidal. And when you find that you can be that curious and that empathic and be able to sit with them in that moment, you're gonna get your answers. You're gonna find out, is there some generational pieces here that are contributing to their current symptomatology? Who knows? But they know. They're the experts on themselves. We as clinicians, we're not the experts. We've learned the skills and tools we need to know how to do good questioning to help them to make the best decisions for them and their life, to help them through their suicidal crisis. So I hope that helped a little bit, but I don't know.
Hello. So as a psychiatric provider and former crisis worker, we're taught and trained to go by, plan, means, and intent. We're taught to assess for those things, and, to the degree that they meet one or the other, then we send forth to call crisis, or we educate them about, crisis line and, hotline and the safety plan and all of that, which is great. However, according to your data and your research, it suggests that the time from when you were thinking about it to the time where it actually happened successfully limits the ability to do any of those interventions successfully. So, what are immediate interventions that you believe could be successful at truly, preventing a successful suicide from happening? Are there interventions that can immediately be helpful? Or are we truly looking at prevention, what we can do on the preventative side to even keep it from going to that direction?
These are such great questions, and I wish I could talk with you for like an hour about this, but I think, okay, so a few things. One, I think that if you look at the Stanley and Brown safety plan, which is like the gold standard, the first step of that safety plan is talking about warning signs, right? So by doing that intervention, before we get to the point where they're in that suicidal crisis, we're helping them to learn from themselves about how to figure out what is going to set me off. So in that sense, I think it is more preventative, doing that safety planning intervention, because the hope is that if we do the safety planning intervention with them, that their ability to de-escalate themselves before getting into the suicidal crisis that's going to be the key. But it also points to how important means safety is, and doing especially just like making sure that if the people you're working with have access to a firearm. And it's not just saying, do you own a gun? You always want to make sure you can say, do you have the ability to get a gun? Because most people don't necessarily own it, especially young adults and teens, but they may have the ability to get one. So, I want to emphasize that piece. But one last thing to bring up to that is this idea of method substitution. And this was part of the reason I actually did this study in the first place, because I was so interested in okay, so let's say we take all of the medication out of the cabinet. We get rid of all of the means. Will they then step it up to something more lethal, like going to and again, trigger warning for people if this is hard to hear about, but will they feel like they want to walk to a train station or go off a higher building, something that's more lethal. I was more interested in that because I personally, when I work with parents, I instruct them, get the Tylenol out of your medicine cabinet because that's lethal, but keep the Advil in there because what if they in that 30-minute window take whatever they have to them? A harm reduction approach is that if they take the bottle of Advil, they will not die from that. So we can save a life in that way. But and what really got me thinking about this was one girl I worked with who she had type 1 diabetes and did her own insulin. And she almost died because her parents took away her razors that she used to cut and to keep herself from killing herself. She would cut herself. And they took away her razors and instead she took a lethal insulin dose and almost died because that method, she stepped it up because she had the access to it. So it's just so hard for clinicians, and the work we do is so difficult and so nuanced. And I think, I really think at the end of the day, it comes down to relationship building with the people you're working with, letting them know they can be honest with you and you're not going to immediately psychiatrically hospitalize them, just sitting with them, being empathic, trying to help them become the expert on themselves so that they can take the steps to do what they need to do to help themselves in a suicidal crisis.
Dr. Kimberly, thank you. My name is Emily Houston. I'm the founder of Home Team, Retired and Injured Athlete Mental Health. One of the areas that I'm becoming really interested in is the impact of NIL and suicidality. And, my personal concern is that death by suicide for NCAA athletes could become the #1 reason. So I'm just curious to hear what your thoughts are on that and
Yeah.
from a holistic perspective.
We don't know what's going to happen with this, right? It's going to be an interesting time period, but I would say, let's remember that it's never one thing that causes suicide. Like it's not like the NIL stuff that will cause it, but what it will do is it will bring up things that will then make the intrapersonal stuff, like, feeling not good enough, like all these kind of like emotions that will be fueled, right? So it's about finding interventions, I think, that will help these young athletes to be able to make their own decisions about, like, social media use and things like that, that may like be able to see, like, how is this affecting me when I look on Instagram and I see that this person got an NIL deal, or how does it feel when I actually compare myself to somebody else? Because these things it's going to happen. We cannot control the fact that like NIL deals are going to happen. Some people are going to get them. Some people aren't. It's going to, it's just going to look way more like a business than like college athletes around. This is just what it is. This is what our society's turning into. So now it's like, how do we help kids to deal with that and manage that? So I don't know. I wish I had the answers for that. Unfortunately, I don't think anyone does.
So I think, we have one, maybe this is the last question. Sounds like a decent one to end on. I'm going to try to paraphrase it for a second. Can you explain the proper steps on how, I'm going to say essentially a first responder, a coach, an athletic trainer, somebody else, a first sergeant, somebody that's directly involved with somebody, how they should handle self-harm among their athlete, among their service member, et cetera?
Self-harm, meaning, so the thing with self-harm is it can mean a lot of different things. I think people often will self-harm but not have suicide intent, which is very different. So I guess my answer would be to be not afraid to ask them about it. Just openly and honestly, just ask them, like, if it's that they maybe have noticed self-harm, like, oh, what's that? And just kind of have like have you hurt yourself? And if you know the person, like just doing it in like a genuinely empathic and curious way. And like, you must be hurting, like, tell me about it. And just remember that you don't need to have to know what to do in that situation. You just need to listen. You need to be able to let them, say how they feel and just tell them that you're there for them. I think too many times we think we need to fix things in conversations when really all we need to do is sit there and listen. And even if you don't know the right steps to take, for young adults and teens, it's like there are trusted adults in your lives you can go to who can help you with those decisions. But don't just shy away from the conversation because it scares you. We should all in this room become comfortable with having discussions about suicide and self-harm. Like we have to be if we want to move the needle on this. Just like mental health and health, mental health is health. Like suicide is a cause of death. We need to be able to talk about it. We need to be able to ask people about it. It's so critical. And I do think we've come a long way, but I think the more and more empathic dialogue we can have with each other about it, I think that's going to make the difference.
Awesome. Thank you. Thank you so much, Kim.
Thank you. Thank you again for having me.
So a couple quick things. I'm gonna go to this mic, I think. Can everybody hear me okay? So not to put in too big of a plug, I don't like doing personal plugs, but we actually do have a training for athletic staff, a suicide prevention training, and one for athlete to athlete. So we'll talk a little bit more about that. So if you see a vital cog table out there, that's our training, and it's for athletic staff and athlete to athlete, student athlete suicide prevention. So, and I know others have trainings as well, but I felt like I had the microphone and I'll put that plug there. So we do have a break until about 1:15, and then our next presentation is going to be on concussions and youth or young athletes. So that'll be a super interesting one, and then we'll have 2 more panels after that. So 15-minute break. So come back 1:15. Thank you. One, two, three. Eyes on me, right? There you go. Yep. I learned that from our daughter does that. Not to us. She just walks away from us. But she does it when she's a coach. So she does it sometimes when she's a coach. So I am here. I'm not going to butcher anything but your name. So I am here to introduce Anne Lontine.
Beautifully done.
Thank you. And she is going to talk about concussions and mental health among youth athletes, right?
Yep.
Right. I won't take it from you. I'll let you speak.
All right. Thanks so much. Can everyone hear me okay? All right. So I'm Anne Lontine. I'm a pediatric psychologist at Children's Hospital of Colorado and an assistant professor at the University of Colorado Department of Physical Medicine and Rehab. And I'm honored to be here today to talk with you all about concussions and mental health, a primer for student athletes and those on their team. The objectives for today's talk are first to describe the connection between concussions and mental health in youth. Next, to identify factors that might contribute to a prolonged recovery or a recovery that's taking a lot longer than we would expected after a concussion for youth. And lastly, to introduce some cognitive behavioral therapy, or what we call CBT strategies, as an effective component of concussion care for student athletes. Taken together, I'm hoping that these objectives highlight the mental health outcomes and the side of recovery for a physical injury like a concussion, because they are just as important. And I'm a little bit biased because I'm a psychologist, but mental health is important. And even though I'm a psychologist, today's talk is not intended to be a substitute for professional mental health care. So if you or someone you know are struggling with mental health concerns, please connect with the mental health counselor. In Colorado, there are really significant movements to increase accessibility for mental health services. And so youth and adults might be eligible for up to 6 free sessions of therapy through something called I Matter. And if you need additional support, contacting your primary care doctor or a school counselor is a wonderful place to start. And I'd be remiss if I didn't highlight that if it's a mental health crisis or emergency, please call 988, which is our mental health equivalent for 911. Go to the nearest emergency room or contact Colorado Crisis Services, which are available 24/7, 365 over phone or over text. And on their website, it says there is no wrong reason to call. So please contact them if you need them. A little bit about me. So I'm a pediatric rehabilitation psychologist. I've been in Colorado for over 12 years now. I received my PhD in child clinical psychology at the University of Denver and completed my training at Pediatric Mental Health Institute here at Children's Colorado and received some specialized training in post-traumatic stress disorders. I matched for internship at Boston Children's Hospital and then went across the country to Stanford to complete my fellowship, which brings me up to my current job where I've been for about 4.5 years now as a pediatric rehab psychologist at Children's. I'm our psychologist and are embedded in our concussion clinic. And a big part of my outpatient job is providing cognitive behavioral therapy and other types of talk therapy for kids after a concussion. It takes a village though, and there are lots of different members of our multidisciplinary team for kids and supporting them after concussion. So I just wanted to take a minute to introduce you to our team members. So we have our medical providers who are the ones diagnosing concussion and ruling out medical emergencies. They're the ones providing initial education, recommendations, guidelines, and reassurance. And qualitative studies show that this is one of the most helpful parts of recovery for kids in knowing what to expect and how long recovery should take. We have our physical therapists who support the physical aspects of a concussion and help with things like balance, dizziness, vestibular challenges, headaches, neck pain, and they help support our youth in returning to activities safely. We have neuropsychologists on our team, which is a fancy way of saying our thinking doctors. They help with some of the cognitive complaints that happen after a concussion, things like brain fog, difficulty with memory or attention. And they can help understand what problems might be due to concussion and what problems might be due to other things. We've studied this. Having a half day of testing is an intervention in and of itself. So for our youth that come in and complete testing, they often report feeling reassured and having a better roadmap of where to go next. We have our behavioral health team, which I'm here to represent today. We're our feelings doctors or our emotional support after a concussion. We provide short-term therapy for kids targeting both unpleasant symptoms that happen after concussion, as well as changes in mood and anxiety. And our goals in this side of the team are really to increase functioning. So we want to get youth back to activities and back to doing things that are important to them, and to teach them some active and adaptive coping strategies along the way. And lastly, we're really lucky to have an educational liaison on our team who helps with getting kids back to school and setting up temporary accommodations in school, providing education for teachers, and really supporting school reentry. So as I said before, it can be complicated, and we each kind of have our niche on the team, all with the goal of getting kids feeling better and feeling more like themselves after a concussion. One of the things we do, as all of our team members do, is provide education about concussions. We know that lots of people Google concussions and they can come across some startling information. Lots of the teens we talk to say, I have a traumatic brain injury. And concussion and traumatic brain injury are used interchangeably. We like to highlight that concussions are a mild version of a traumatic brain injury, that it's an injury to the brain that disrupts how the brain usually works, typically caused by a sudden jolt or a blow to the brain, although lots of people hit their heads and never sustain a concussion. And it's really that rapid movement in the skull which leads to temporary chemical changes in the brain, which is what causes those unpleasant symptoms at the beginning. So if we look at concussions on CT or MRI scans, they don't show up. They do not include any kind of structural change and do not involve bleeding to the brain. So it's important to know kind of what happened to you and to empower youth with knowledge about what we expect with recovery after this. Concussions are really common, so between 1 to 2 million youth experience a concussion every year. We know that about 1 in 5 teenagers have had a history of a concussion in their lifetime. And that, I know I'm talking to an audience of student athletes, but concussions are really prevalent among athletes, particularly among contact sports. So football, hockey, soccer, wrestling, and rugby are some of our riskier activities. In the general population, we see peaks in concussion for teenagers ages 15 to 19. We know that other developmental tasks come online in this time, things like driving, that can be related to this. And then we also know that males are more likely to have concussions than females. Some of this is thought to be due to risk-taking and impulsivity. There are lots of different ways besides sports that concussions can happen. So things like car accidents or assaults or falls. An interesting fact is that falls account for about 40% of concussions. And I put this on there to highlight that concussions can happen to anybody, and they happen to a lot of people. And so sometimes this information can help the youth we're working with feel a little bit less alone, that they're not the only person or the first person we've seen that has a concussion. And when we think about recovery and trajectories after a concussion, I want to highlight that every individual's recovery is different. So although most youth return to baseline within a few days to a few weeks, we know that up to 30% or 1 in 3 youth will report persisting symptoms at 4 weeks. And that 1 month marker is really our marker for categorizing recovery as being a prolonged recovery for youth. There are 4 categories of persisting symptoms in this prolonged recovery period. They fall into physical symptoms, things like headaches or dizziness, cognitive symptoms, things like attention problems or issues with processing speed, emotional symptoms, so irritability or mood swings or anxiety, and then behavioral symptoms, so changes in behaviors, things like sleep. And for youth, the most common persisting symptoms are fatigue, headaches, irritability or grumpiness, and mood swings. And I want to highlight that there's an overlay between persisting symptoms and mental health. So for fatigue, for example, that can be due to changes in activity level after a concussion. It can also be due to things like depression that can happen after a concussion that can cause fatigue. So it can be really hard to disentangle how much of this is due to the concussion, how much of it is due to other changes or increases in mental health symptoms after a concussion. So it's a little bit of a chicken and an egg, the link between mental health and concussions. So we know that 50% or half of youth that have a sports-related concussion endorse emotional symptoms after their concussion. We know that youth with concussions experience more mental health challenges. So when we compare youth with a concussion or head injury to someone that broke their arm, youth with concussion are 40% more likely to develop emotional challenges compared to their same age peers that have an orthopedic injury without a head impact. About 1 in 3 adolescents with a concussion report feeling increased anxiety or depression afterwards. And for 50% of these youth, these are brand new concerns. They'd never experienced anxiety or depression before. So I want to highlight that there is a high prevalence of changes in mood and anxiety and mental health symptoms after a concussion. But we also know that these are risk factors for prolonged recovery. So for youth that have anxiety or depression before their concussion, they can take twice as long to recover from a concussion than their peers without mental health challenges. And when we study all of the different symptoms that come up after concussion, psychological symptoms often take the longest time to resolve. So we hear kids feeling better from dizziness perspectives or from headache or fatigue, but I'd say about 3 to 4 months after concussion is when we see increases in anxiety and depression start to go away. In terms of why this happens, we know that there are many reasons that kids might have lower mood, increased anxiety, or new challenges after a concussion, and I wanted to put a couple of them up here. So it's particularly for our athletes who are incredibly active, that there's a significant change that can happen in activity level with restrictions in returning to sports that can trigger mood and anxiety symptoms, especially if sports are your coping mechanism. We know that being less active can lead to sleep difficulties, and that can lead to fatigue and changes in mood and anxiety. That isolation from teammates, feeling lonely, that can trigger changes in mood and anxiety. That you're experiencing all kinds of unpleasant symptoms, so headaches, dizziness, brain fog, and that feeling bad, physical health can impact our mental health. We often hear that concussions are unique because they're an invisible injury. Others can't see the impact. So unlike a broken arm where you might have a cast on and someone can look at you and say, oh, I know it happened there, that others looking at our youth with concussions can't always see what happened, and that can be really frustrating for our kids. And then significant changes in identity, especially if sports is a big part of who our teens and our young adults are, that not being able to play in an important game or an important season, that can lead to kind of just feelings of loss and wondering, who am I? So although pre-injury mental health is our strongest predictor of how people do after a concussion in terms of mental health, many people without any psychiatric history report new onset anxiety and depression symptoms. And at Children's Hospital, we work with kids from ages 2 to 25. And so we are often thinking about a developmental pattern in the types of symptoms we're seeing. So for our adolescents and young adults, we're often looking for internalizing symptoms, things like depression, anxiety, and post-traumatic stress. For our younger children, typically after a concussion, we see an increase in externalizing behaviors. So things like impulsivity and difficulties with attention and acting out behaviors. And despite how common mental health concerns are, we know that there's a significant gap in the field, that very few youth are referred for therapy. And I think this highlights the need for screening and proactively discussing